Great. So my essay focuses on an application of Tibetan paradigms of revelation to the study of Tolkien's life and works, focusing predominantly on two key revelatory traditions in Tibet known as terma, or treasure, and drun, known as epic or myth. While Tolkien was almost certainly entirely unaware of these traditions, there are significant parallels between them and his own mythopoeic process, including the important role of dream experiences, language, and seemingly channeled knowledge recorded often at furious speed. I argue that for Tolkien himself, the experience of composition likely felt revelatory in nature, and determining whether it was in fact the product of revelation or creative inspiration was likely not a straightforward process, requiring careful negotiation and even a degree of guesswork, especially for Tolkien himself. While this might be described as a Buddhist approach to Tolkien, I am less interested in what Tolkien can teach us about Buddhism and more in how Buddhism, specifically Tibetan Buddhism, might help us understand Tolkien and the nature of his legendarium. For an overview of existing scholarship on Buddhist approaches to Tolkien, I would direct readers to Douglas Charles Kane's 2022 paper, Tirdan the Shipwright, itself a notable contribution to this niche field of research. As Kane notes, and as is quite self-evident, Tolkien was clearly not a Buddhist, nor is there much evidence that he was overtly influenced by Buddhist teachings. However, his bypassing of primary world religion in expressing essential moral and spiritual values absolutely allows for a plurality of religious and spiritual approaches to his work. Thus far, most Buddhist approaches to Tolkien focus on the ways in which various characters embody the core virtues of a bodhisattva, a being that is set upon the path to liberation, guided by bodhicitta, or altruistic intent. Frodo, Gandalf, Tom Bombadil, Círdan, and others have all been described as bodhisattvic characters. Something that I would like to contribute to this specific sort of line of inquiry is that while in Mahayana Buddhism, one of the dominant forms of Buddhism, there is a vast array of bodhisattvas. The first historical use of this term was specifically in reference to the Buddha himself, specifically in stories about his previous lives. These are found in a body of canonical literature known as the Jataka tales, which follow stories of the bodhisattva through 546 previous lives as humans, animals, gods, and spirits. These exemplify poignant moral lessons, like the virtues of generosity and the perils of vanity. But they're not exclusively Buddhist stories. You may know some of them. They're derived from a vast body of broadly Afro-Eurasian folk tales, indeed fairy stories, that spread widely across the Silk Roads, with correlates found in numerous global storytelling traditions like the Thousand and One Nights, Aesop's fables, and even the Canterbury Tales. It was very common for stories like these to be shared, expanded upon, and repackaged in an array of cultural contexts. And indeed, if stories like The Lord of the Rings had been circulating in Eurasia 2,500 years ago, it's quite possible that figures like Frodo or Gandalf would have made appearances in the tales of the Bodhisattva. But the focus of this paper is, of course, Tibet. And this specific line of inquiry really began for me 10 years ago, when I was staying at a Buddhist retreat center in Massachusetts, attending an intensive for my Tibetan medicine school. I was speaking with the center's grounds manager, who was an older Tibetan man who began his journey with Tibetan Buddhism, an older American man, who had begun his journey with Tibetan Buddhism in the 1970s as a student of Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, this guy here on the right. He asked me how I came to get involved in Tibetan Buddhism, and I began, as I always do, by explaining that my spiritual journey was really sparked initially by my young fascination with Tolkien's works. And he responded, "Oh, that's interesting. Did you know? Trungpa once told us that Lord of the Rings is a kind of terma." Now, I'll return to that term in a second, but I was quite taken aback by this comment. I was never a fan of Trungpa himself because he had quite a scandalous legacy, but he did play a monumental role in the establishment of Tibetan Buddhism in the West, and was indeed quite active at the height of Tolkien's popularity, even spending some time in Oxford a few years after Tolkien's retirement. Perhaps most importantly, he claimed to be a tertön, or a treasure revealer himself, making this comment quite intriguing. But what is a terma? Terma, or treasure, is a kind of spiritual time capsule believed to be hidden by great masters of the past for future revelation. Most of these treasures are spiritual in nature, consisting of things like liturgies and philosophical tracts, but statues, relics, implements, and even stories can all be revealed as a kind of terma. These images here on the right are of physical termas. In the Yungdrung Bun tradition, some are regarded as being positively prehistoric, concealed originally 18,000 years ago. But in the more prominent Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism, most are linked to the legendary 8th century Tantric Buddhist wizard, or Vidyadhara, Padmasambhava, who's said to have hidden a vast array of treasures for his disciples to reveal in the future. Some he hid in the landscape as buried earth treasures, or sater, while others were concealed directly and non-physically in the mind streams of his disciples as mind treasures, or gTer, intended to be recovered or indeed remembered in their future reincarnations. This construct of terma really rose to prominence in Tibet around the 12th century CE as a powerful tool for establishing new/old canonical traditions, at once allowing for an indigenization of Tibetan Buddhist systems of knowledge, and also as a method for integrating new liturgical and philosophical evolutions as authentic Buddhist teachings. This terma tradition remains alive and well today. Some termas have even been revealed far outside of Tibet, with one living tertön, Adzam Pela Rinpoche, claiming to have revealed a mine treasure at a retreat center in Colorado. Tertöns themselves are famously charismatic figures, sometimes performing magical feats like pulling treasure caskets out of cliff walls or recovering them from underwater in front of often giant crowds of people. While each tertön's story is unique, there are some relatively standard archetypes and motifs that have emerged over time, including those that are listed here. In regards to transmission, while some termas are physical objects that a tertön reveals from a physical place, others, as mentioned, are transmitted mentally or audially, or quite frequently through dream experiences. These terma texts are usually codified in a non-human language. This is known as Khandro Dayik, or the twilight script of the Dakinis. And it's believed that this can only be effectively interpreted and translated by a tertön. Sometimes merely encountering just a syllable or a word of this strange language allows them to unpack and translate a massive body of work. Tertöns often also receive a treasure registry or a temjang early on in life, which functions as a kind of list of all of the treasures that they can reveal in their lifetimes. It's very common, however, for them to leave these lists uncompleted by their death, leaving many unfinished projects for their heirs and reincarnations to complete. Treasure custodians, or terdak, are usually these long-lived spirit beings that are installed as guardians of terma by past masters, often linked to geographical and topographic features like enchanted mountains, lakes, and caves. These beings belong to a wide range of eco-daemonological spirit classes in Tibet, like the Lu, or Nagas, who, especially in Tibet, sometimes appear as distinctly elf-like beings. The consort is an interesting feature of terma because it's believed that tertöns require intimate companionship to successfully reveal their treasures. This is a distinctive feature of the tradition, often receiving a great deal of criticism from more monastically oriented Tibetan Buddhist sects. Nearly all tertöns are supported by a consort, many regarded as great masters in their own right, who are often involved in the revelation, transcription, codification, and even the historical concealment of important treasures. In some cases, these treasures are only transmitted to a single heir during a tertön's life, who's then principally held responsible for its dissemination. They often expand and elaborate upon the terma cycle, composing additional materials while also working to spread the teachings to those who are deemed suitable. Most termas are of a distinctly religious nature, but there is another category of Tibetan revelation that really blurs the line between religion and popular myth. This is known as Drun, sometimes translated as epic or myth. This term usually refers to the Tibetan mythological cycle known as the Epic of King Gesar of Ling. This is King Gesar here on the right. This is regarded by some as the longest story ever told, with millions of recorded verses composed by thousands of storytellers over the centuries. A Gesar bard or a drunken can approach their craft in many different ways. Some learn the epic through oral tradition, some through written works, others divine aspects of the stories through divinatory procedures. But the most famous drunken, the most famous bards are known as bäp-drung or revelatory bards, literally those into whom the myths descend. These bäp-drungs are no ordinary storytellers. It's believed that they were themselves once the characters in the stories in their past lives, making their inspired mythopoeic accounts a kind of past life memory. Signs of their abilities often appear early in life, usually with intense dreams and also illness, sort of inducting them into their gifts. But these gifts are not without their curses, and refusal to fulfill their storytelling duties is often seen to result in further illness. Bäp-drungs are particularly known for the remarkable speed at which their compositions are seemingly challenged. Shambe Gyaltso notes, quote, "Once they started, it was as if the narration were a mighty river flowing quick." And he goes on to say the pace would be kept up for a few days, a few months, or a few years, to the point that even if they were to continue for a whole lifetime, they still could not finish the story. There is another tradition of more conventional treasure revelation amongst Gesar bards as well, including stories that are revealed as earth treasures, as physical texts, and also as mind treasures. In the latter, the Gesar tertön excavates stories from their subconscious, quote, in the same way that a miner digs treasure out of the dark recesses of a mountain. An interesting contemporary example of this is Anido Daso Wangmo, who you can see here on the right, the late Anido Daso Wangmo. She was a Tibetan doctor and nun from eastern Tibet who revealed countless Gesar mind treasures throughout her life. But fearing that their publicization would pull her away from her duties as a physician, she opted to burn nearly all of them after putting them on paper. While all tertöns feel duty-bound to at least write down what comes to them, not all seek to capitalize on their talents. Now, it's not difficult to see some similarities between the experiences of Tibetan revelatory figures and J.R.R. Tolkien. While he fortunately did not resort to burning his notes and manuscripts, one often does get the sense that a lot of his material was recorded out of necessity rather than personal ambition. That he perceived this as a process of recording rather than inventing is made repeatedly clear. For instance, in his semi-legendary account of spontaneously writing the words in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit while grading papers on a summer's day. In a 1956 letter to an unidentified Mr. Thompson, he writes, quote, "I have long ceased to invent. I wait till I seem to know what really happened, or till it writes itself." The Treebeard chapter of The Two Towers is a notable example of this, with Tolkien claiming he had no recollection of inventing Ents. And in fact, many important sections of The Lord of the Rings seem to have arisen in a similar fashion, including Bree, Moria, Lothlorien, Fangorn, the House of Eorl, the Stewards of Gondor, the Palantiri, and even key characters like Strider and Saruman. All of these arose as unpremeditated surprises, unbeknownst to Tolkien before their emergence on the page. I argue that this authorial experience is quite indistinguishable from a process of revelatory transmission. Tolkien's translation conceit is also, in this context, quite interesting. His works, much like Terma, are ostensibly originally composed in a mysterious language, in some cases non-human, which Tolkien was left to translate into modern English. Naturally, we have to accept this as a fabulous framing story rather than a real description of a physical process that he undertook. But in fact, much the same can be said about tertöns. But based on his notes and his personal recollections, his actual process of composition does seem to resemble the revelation of mind terma, excavating tales from the depths of one's mind, often triggered by an experience of linguistic enchantment. While Tolkien never claimed to have a run-in with the Eldar in his time, or these treasure custodians, the motif of the treasure custodian is nicely represented in the framing story for the Book of Lost Tales, in which Ælfwine retrieves the tales of the First Age from the elvish lore masters of Tol Eressëa. He then, much like a tertön himself, translates the materials into his own tongue, which are then translated into modern English by Tolkien. Notably, this multi-stage process resembles quite closely certain models of re-recovery found in the Tibetan terma tradition. Furthermore, the repeated appearances of Ælfwine Eriol through figures like Errol, Alboin, etc., hint at a kind of treasure custodian role running through many layers of the legendarium. As noted, intimate relationship is not only permitted, but indeed obligatory in the case of tertöns, with qualified consorts playing important roles as teachers, muses, scribes, and custodians themselves of a treasure revealer's work. It's not difficult to see Tolkien's relationship with Edith in such a light, a lifelong love affair spanning the entirety of the Middle-earth revelation. Not only is she credited as a key inspiration for stories like the Tale of Tinuviel, she also assisted in typing up many of her husband's written works, and was an ongoing source of inspiration, care, and invaluable support throughout his life, largely facilitating Tolkien's creative vision. The heir, of course, was his son Christopher, who dedicated his entire adult life to collating, editing, and publishing his father's work. An interesting corollary of this in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition can be found in the figure of Sunten Yeshe Zung, who was a 12th century figure, who was the sole recipient of two major proto-terma works revealed by his teacher, Yutok Yönten Gompo, including the famous Four Tantras of Tibetan medicine. After Yutok died, Sunten spent decades promoting these works, and this raised quite a few suspicions amongst Yutok's sons and his more senior students. Some quipped that Sunten wrote the texts himself and was merely riding Yutok's proverbial coattails in pursuit of his own notoriety. It's quite notable that similar allegations are part of what led Christopher Tolkien to publish his father's notes and drafts in the History of Middle-earth series. Now, lucid dreams and dreams in general, they play a central role in revelatory traditions around the world, including in Tibet, where lucid dreaming is an actively cultivated skill, and many tertöns reveal their treasures through dream experiences. References to dreams can, of course, be found even in the earliest layers of the legendarium, including the framing story for the Book of Lost Tales, in which Alfwine the mariner takes the elvish name Eriol, one who dreams alone. While Tolkien never states explicitly that Eriol's journey to Tol Eressëa was itself a dream voyage, Valinor was notably at this stage still accessible to certain humans, especially children, via the Olore Male, the Path of Dreams, fashioned by Lorien as an enchanted holloway by which the children of the fathers of men once traveled to the undying lands. While this idea was ultimately abandoned, Tolkien's interest in dreams only increased with time. In The Lost Road, he began to explore dreams more earnestly as a time travel device, inspired in large part by J.W. Dunn's An Experiment with Time. Dunn developed a theory of multidimensional time, which posited that while the conscious mind is bound to a linear experience of temporality, the subconscious mind is not limited in this respect, with the dream state serving as a means by which one can effectively observe past, present, and future events. Verlin Flieger notes that, however, he was wary of the disenchanting effect of dream narratives, namely, quote, the rude return to waking reality that calls the dream into question. While he certainly believed that dreams had the capacity to unlock strange powers of the mind, he felt that reducing an enchanted account to a dreamtime illusion, quote, cheats deliberately the primal desire at the heart of Feri, the realization independent of the conceiving mind of imagined wonder. Tolkien negotiates this paradox with great subtlety in the Book of Lost Tales and The Lost Road, mentioning dreams without explicitly betraying that the tales themselves might have arisen in a character's dreams. However, likewise, beyond his well-known Atlantis haunting, Tolkien never claimed that his stories arose from his own dreams. But given his concerns about the disenchantment that occurs upon learning that a writer's tale is only a thing imagined in his sleep, it is questionable whether he would have deemed it useful to share such a thing in the first place. Notably, there's a similar wariness in many Tibetan hagiographies. While visionary experiences are very frequently noted to occur in the nighttime, just before or after sleep, they're only rarely identified as dreams in traditional accounts. However, many modern tertöns, like Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche, speak far more candidly about the centrality of dreams in their treasure revelations. This Atlantis haunting, Tolkien's, quote, terrible recurrent dream beginning with memory of the great wave towering up and coming in ineluctably over the trees and green fields, seems to have been of significant interest to him, though it's something that he dealt with quite privately. He surmised that it may have even been an inherited condition, noting that his son Michael was plagued by the same dreams, even though neither of this knew about the other until Michael was in his 30s. In a 1956 letter, Tolkien remarked that a great deal of his most important mythopoeic work occurred, quote, at other levels, when one is saying, how do you do, or even sleeping. One is left to wonder whether the ineluctable wave was indeed the only motif to arise from Tolkien's dream life. His use of dreams became much more explicit in the Notion Club papers, which is also the most uncharacteristically autobiographical work in the Legendarium. In it, 20th century scholars Michael Raymer and Alwyn Loudham use lucid dreams to recover mytho-historical accounts of the fall of Numenor and details of Elvish and Adunaic languages. Loudham even takes on Tolkien's famous experience of linguistic enchantment with the Earendel couplet from Christ I. The specific identities, however, of these characters in the Notion Club papers, as well as in The Lost Road, is of particular interest here. In both works, Tolkien flirts with the idea of serial incarnations, positioning dreams as not merely a method of traveling back and forth in time, but indeed through a dreamer's own pre- and reincarnations. Loudham is ultimately identified as a descendant and a kind of reincarnation of Elendil. This is certainly not a derivative of Dunn's theories, but rather Tolkien's own contribution to the dream travel scheme. Now, this isn't to say that Tolkien necessarily believed in reincarnation, though he did once note that even in the primary world, it seemed at least plausible as a potential mode of existence for rational incarnate creatures. But it is evident that he at least considered serial incarnations as a potential explanatory framework for revelation through dreams. Notably, this is the same paradigm found in systems like Tibetan terma and Drun. By explicitly omitting references to primary world religion from most of his Legendarium, Tolkien enabled readers from myriad ontological and cultural backgrounds to engage with his work on its own terms. The Legendarium is not a spiritual void waiting to be filled by our own beliefs, nor is it a new religion that seeks to commandeer and dominate our worldviews. It's a different thing entirely, though what exactly it is remains somewhat of an open question. In Tibet, the recovery of lost or hidden knowledge through revelatory experience was and still very much is afforded as a real possibility. But in Tolkien's environment, there was no such affordance. With his alleged terma comment, I don't think that Trungpa was implying that Tolkien was some kind of hidden Buddhist. Instead, as a tertön himself, he seems to be speaking with some authority about the self-vexing experience of revelation. It's perhaps not entirely different from the experience of creative inspiration, and coming to a decision about what such an experience really is requires guesswork and negotiation. As philosophers of science often argue, observation itself is theory-laden. Even Tolkien had to negotiate his own personal explanation for his work based on his own experiences, cultural conditioning, social context, and personal beliefs and values. The similarities between Tolkien's work and paradigms like terma and drung are notable, and its description as a kind of terma, or indeed a kind of drung epic, is compelling. Tolkien's intent to produce a body of more or less connected legend ranging from the large and cosmogonic to the level of romantic fairy story, while still leaving room for other minds and hands wielding paint and music and drama, is itself in many ways a suitable description of the gTer project in Tibet. The Legendarium, much like the gTer epic, isn't just somebody's personal work or intellectual property. It's a timely myth of revelatory proportions, offering a path towards recovery of a clear view of reality, and indeed also our existential health, and an escape from the ontological shackles of disenchanted modernity into the consolation of a happy ending. Importantly, Tolkien regarded faerie as being explicitly not religious. He says this in his essay on Smith of Wootton Major. At its core, he found a far more ecumenical compound of, quote, awareness of a limitless world outside our domestic parish, a love in ruth and admiration for the things in it, and a desire for wonder, marvels, both perceived and conceived. This, he claimed, is, quote, as necessary for the health and complete functioning of the human as is sunlight for physical life. By proactively framing his revealed materials as fictitious, Tolkien avoided having his work sacralized or stigmatized while preserving the organic and enchanted spirit of the work. He made no claims to a revelation of historical facts, nor of sacred scriptures. Neither was anywhere close to his ambition. But he did, on his own word, deal in truths in all their vastness and specificity. Instead of revealing history, he revealed myths, and often at furious speed. Thank you all very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Erik, for that fascinating comparison between, I mean, I really appreciate the way in which you draw together theories of mythopoetic inspiration and storytelling across these wildly different traditions. Tolkien coming out of 20th century Roman Catholicism and the Tibetan tradition. This is some really, really exciting parallels in that. We don't have any questions in the chat. I did just one of the things I wanted to invite your reflections on something, which is as someone who writes and storytells myself, there is, I think, the experience, if you're a writer of fiction, is often a sense of discovering what's already there. We often talk about characters taking on a life of their own, and in fact, that was brought up in one of the questions earlier in the seminar. And that seems to me at least a common feature of a sense of storytelling or story writing as a revelatory experience. And I'm wondering if you have some more reflections on that aspect, either of the Tibetan tradition or Tolkien's creative practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like I said, I think the line between revelation and creative inspiration is remarkably blurry and thin. And I think really there's a distinction between the experience and the explanatory framework that's attributed to it or is overlaid onto it. And the experience is probably not so dissimilar. And I think that it's quite consistent amongst many different contexts and different forms of storytellers and myth writers. The explanatory framework is itself entirely dependent upon a number of different factors, not only the author or the creator's own perspective or their own ideas about it, but also all of the baggage that they come to the table with. So I think that line is quite blurry. I've always felt that Trungpa's comment is really less about Tolkien and more about terma in a way. It's really speaking to the fact that these revelatory traditions, they can be, I don't think we should doubt the earnestness with which the creators develop them, but that's an explanatory framework. And I think the experience at its root isn't really a monopoly. There's no monopoly held by any one tradition on an experience of revelation. These can be very similar phenomena.
I would happen to agree with you as something a sociologist of religion as well. So that was a great presentation. Oh, we look like we might have one question in the chat really quick. So anonymous attendee says, to me, the mythologizing of Tolkien the man as a larger-than-life revelatory figure is one of the chief problems of contemporary Tolkien fandom and scholarship, seen most troublingly in the neo-Nazi approach to his life and work. How do you distinguish your approach from the more harmful urge to use Tolkien in this way? I think that's a really good question.
Well, very good question. I think it comes down to a distancing to a certain extent, or a separation between belief-based religion and myth. I don't think these are the same thing. Myth can be an aspect of what we call religion in our sort of cultural context, but it doesn't require belief in order for it to be transformative or in order for it to positively or negatively impact our experience of the world. I think that taking his experience of revelation as an earnest experience is something that was more than just contrivance. I don't think that necessitates the sort of unsavory, reductions of his work to battles between, white Westerners and non-white Easterners and so on. Those sorts of ideas and the sort of cultural essentialism, that's a very different sort of thing. I think a lot of those approaches fundamentally just misunderstand philology. They misunderstand the chronological and sort of temporal placement of his work. It doesn't speak to modern cultural traditions. It doesn't speak to race. It doesn't speak to modern primary world religions. It preempts all of that by thousands of years. So I think actually taking it somewhat more seriously is a way to circumvent some of those risks, because we're moving away from the allegorical sort of perspective that, oh, this is basically just a story about a race war. And it brings it into more of a historical and mytho-historical context. That would be my off-the-cuff response, but I certainly, yeah, I mean, in my experience, most of those kinds of approaches come from the perspective that he was solely a conservative Catholic writer who was writing a Christian allegory about the purity of white people and Western Europeans in contrast to the rest of the world. And I don't think that has anything to do with acknowledging his work as revelatory versus a creative work. It's a separate issue, in my opinion.